Hi, welcome back to the Woodwind Legacy Series. I'm Ed Jaffe, and today we're going to spend some time with the esteemed principal clarinet of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, Bill Hudgins. Bill's had a very interesting career and has been with the orchestra now for about 25 years, initially as the second clarinetist, and then beginning in 1994, he assumed the principal clarinet chair. He's had a long series of orchestras where he's served as principal clarinet in the Atlanta Opera, Charleston Symphony down in Caracas, Venezuela. He's a longtime member of the Boston Chamber Players and has given us many wonderful recordings with that group. So today we're going to spend a little time, get to know Bill a little bit and get his ideas about playing principal clarinet, studying clarinet, working with reeds, mouthpieces, horns, etc. So anyway, Bill, thank you so much for taking the time to come down and share your knowledge with us. Really, I'm looking forward to this greatly.
Well, I'm happy to be here. I don't know what you'll learn from me exactly, but...
Well, I'm sure there's much to be learned. First of all, a principal clarinet or principal flutist, principal, trumpet player, concert master, are people who generally are very much, out there making solo recordings, concertos, performances, teaching in universities, and you seem to be the most humble and quiet person I've ever witnessed as in a principal chair. You are so devoted to your job and and to the Boston Chamber Players, but we have yet to see a solo CD and I'm not aware of you being affiliated with any university. So I'd like to get a little bit of background about your career and how you have established yourself now in the principal chair and how you work your life around the job. So let's start off with your background, where you grew up and who you studied with.
Well, my elementary school and junior high and high school years, my family moved a lot. And in fact, I went to 10 different schools in the 12 years.
Wow.
And part of that was just because it seemed like if we were in one place for a while, generally we were in one area for around 3 years at a time. But they would change the township lines on me, or I would be changing from elementary to junior high or junior high to high school. So because of that, I ended up getting a lot of different training from different clarinet teachers.
Huh.
And so maybe that in some ways actually kind of ended up being why I became a musician, because that became one of the constants in my life, that I could go to a new place and find my niche more or less by being in the band or the orchestra.
Right.
So.
And what part of the country was this?
So I was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My father worked for Westinghouse Electric. We used to have their headquarters there.
Right.
And I think maybe I started clarinet around the 5th grade in that area near Pittsburgh. And then at one point we moved to Indianapolis, Indiana. And I think there is where I got my true kind of first real clarinet training, because my mother asked around. She said, one of my sons is playing the clarinet. Who should he study with? And somebody said, oh, you should go to this Indianapolis Symphony Orchestra and see if you can take lessons with a member of a clarinet player that's a member of the orchestra.
Sounds like good advice.
Right. It is good advice, I think. And so I started training with Achille Rossi, who was the second clarinetist in the Indianapolis Symphony for over 40 years, I believe.
Wow.
And he was a fiery Italian man that was very picky with me as a player. I remember him holding my chin down for whole lessons at a time.
Wow.
Saying, no, you can't bite up with the chin, And then and he also had a real love for opera music. And so one of the books that he trained me out of was this Lazarus series of music,
Sure.
clarinet books,
Yeah.
which are almost totally based on little opera tunes.
Yes.
And
And if I remember correctly, also a lot of duets
right,
included in that.
and
So you
he
always,
would play a lot of
right.
duets
I
with
remember
me as
doing
well.
that. Yeah.
And what's funny is even to this day, I go back to some of those, the Lazarus book, and still keep playing these same little opera etudes that I've played for years.
Interesting.
And I fell in love with them in a certain way. I liked the whole melodic aspect of it, of that part of the playing, the clarinet.
Wow. And so obviously getting a fine teacher right off the bat is so important, especially just for keeping the enthusiasm for music going. And I think many people that I've talked to, and I can speak for myself as well, that was also the case. You know, it really makes a difference. It's sometimes the telltale moment in one's career. The first teacher that you have can really make or break it for you. And so for our listeners, if you're teaching and you're working with young students, it'd be good to keep this in mind, how important that influence can be. But you also studied with a number of, also big name players, the principal of the Cincinnati Symphony, Richard Waller, who's a teacher of yours.
The Aspen Music Festival one summer.
Right.
And well, what was interesting is, so after we lived in Indianapolis, then we moved to Charlotte, North Carolina. And there I started studying with a student of Robert Marcellus's. So there was a Canadian clarinetist who played in the Charlotte Symphony for a while, and he was a real fanatic of Marcellus's playing, and he immediately made me buy the Marcellus recording of the Mozart concerto and made me listen to it and over. And then after lessons, a lot of times he would sit me down and make me listen to Cleveland Orchestra recordings, and so that kind of got me intrigued then with a slightly different style of playing. And I worked hard. And then from Charlotte, North Carolina, a few years later, then I finished high school outside of Philadelphia in Swarthmore. And there I studied with the retired second clarinetist of the Philadelphia Orchestra, whose name was Jules Serpentini. Right. And he was instrumental in keeping me going, not so much in developing with a certain sound or anything. Although I do remember now, he had this old mouthpiece that had been broken in half and glued back together. And it was, and I can't remember the name of the manufacturer now. It was not a Casper or a Shedville or something.
Robert, maybe?
I forget.
Bettany or...
No, it was not a bit. Now I'll never remember it now that I'm trying to remember. But he would have me play. I think it had a beautiful tone, but I think he thought something was a little off with it now. So he didn't. Well, he was retired, so he wasn't going to really play professionally anymore anyway. And he was very old when I studied with him. Later on, when I got into the Boston Symphony, some of the colleagues, Harold Wright and Al Genovese and stuff, they would see that in my bio that I had studied with Jules Serpentini, and they'd start asking me how old I was. And they were like, "What? How could you have done that? He would have been dead, wouldn't he?" But anyway, that was good for me those last 2 years.
Yeah, wow. And then so. How did you end up ultimately going to Boston University and studying with Harold Wright?
Well, it was lucky advice as a high school senior in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania. I played in the Delaware County Youth Orchestra in that area, and a lot of the Philadelphia Orchestra members would work with that youth orchestra. I remember George Crumb actually used to come and play viola in the back of the viola section sometimes with us. And I used to borrow George Crumb's father's old A clarinet was lent to me to use because I didn't have my own A clarinet. But
And was it tuned in?
oh, it was horrible. I mean, I had a wraparound octave key, register key. But anyway, the guidance counselor at Swarthmore High School had a friend that was a concert pianist. And I don't know the name anymore, but she asked the concert pianist, here's a young man that wants to go study to be in a professional orchestra. What should he do? And so, they said, you should go to a major city and study with one of the members of a major symphony orchestra. So I went and I auditioned at a few different places, and I ended up at Boston University. And my first year there, I actually studied with Pasquale Cardillo, the second clarinetist of the Boston Symphony and the principal of the Boston Pops for many years. And at the end of my freshman year, he spoke to Harold and he said, you should take on me.
Right.
So I felt quite lucky that he was willing to do that, and then that Harold was willing to take me on.
Sure.
So then I had 3 good years with Harold.
Wow.
And a student capacity.
Wow. I mean, that's talking about having a bit of good luck and good fortune to be around Harold as a young player. That must have been an immense influence on you. I mean, I can still hear that somewhat in your playing. But what was it like studying with Harold? What were the lessons like working with him? Because Harold's sort of a iconic figure, and now is a legend. But his teaching and whatnot people don't know that much about how he approached lessons and so forth. It's sort of kept quiet.
Well, he was not really very interested in teaching. I mean, he really liked playing, and so in my lessons, it was not very organized. I mean, what I find, just recently, I went back and kind of studied the 2 different paths of kind of the major sounds from Marcellus and from Harold that I think were a pretty big influence on me. And it was, I figured it out, If you went back, Harold Wright's teacher was Ralph McLean.
Right.
You go back from Ralph McLean, his teacher was Gaston Hemlin. And then you go back to his teacher was Charles Turbin. And then his teacher was Closet. And then if you go backwards from Robert Marcellus, his teacher was Daniel Bonnard, whose teacher was Henry Lefebvre,
right,
whose teacher was Cyril Rose, whose teacher was Closet. So both paths go back. So, but what was interesting with Harold, and to go back to the Gaston Hamlin and the Charles Turbin and the Closet, was that these men were all associated with like the Perrier studies, which Harold made me study some, or Gaston Hamlin, I believe, was the premier Rhapsody by Debussy.
Yes.
And so it was kind of a little bit more the French side than maybe, well, I would have been pretty much French on the other side too, but
right.
I was just interested to kind of see those connections as I started to go look back through those teachers.
It's interesting because both Harold Wright and Bob Marcellus had very different approaches to sound, and their playing reflected that. Yet the lineage is from the Paris Conservatory French School of
right,
which I think speaks also to the fact that that school, and when people think of, I think in terms of schools of sound, you usually have a very fixed idea, but the French school of sound actually had, I believe, had quite a bit of variance, and I know in the flute area as well. It's not just Moïse. I mean, Taffanel and Gobert and Moïse and Barrère and Laurent. I mean, there's very different players. So the French school seemed to have a lot of flexibility to it.
Right. I mean, it's really interesting just within the clarinet thing because if you go back to Closet, I think it was shortly before Closet that the Paris Conservatory determined that they said they were now going to predominantly teach that the clarinet mouthpiece should be with the reed on the bottom against the lower lip,
as opposed to
as
the
opposed
top,
to the right against the top lip.
which was I know a lot of great Italian players who
Right.
came over here. Cioffi, I know when
Right.
he first came over, played with the reed.
Cioffi learned the clarinet playing over in Naples
Right.
with the reed on top against the top lip.
Huh.
And then a connection I had not realized until just the other day was that this man that I first studied with in Indianapolis, Achille Rossi, went to the New England Conservatory of Music and studied with Cioffi. And so there was this all connecting
It's all
thing
yeah.
there that I had not realized, this whole circle. So it was kind of fun
Very
to
interesting.
see that. And
Yeah. What actually brings me to one of the questions I was very interested in asking you is that you seem to me to be a reflection of the traditional school of the French school of Cahuzac and Bonnard, transferred down to their students in McLean and Harold Wright and Bob Marsalis. And this is, I mean, from my own personal way of playing, that was the tradition that I was taught and that I still love. My principal teacher, Joe Allard, was a student of Hamlin's and Bonnard.
Okay.
So, without understanding that at the time as a student, that was what I was sort of introduced to with regard to the music, the sound concept, embouchure, etc. But in today's contemporary clarinet world, orchestrally speaking, it seems that, from my perspective, the people who are winning jobs and the sounds that have become more common in orchestras today, especially over the last 20, 25 years, don't reflect the French school as much as the sounds that I heard when I grew up. Do you perceive it that way as well?
I think that is true. I think it's just kind of natural progressions of waves that come and go of the interest in certain types of sounds. And in some ways, I've seen some interest now in people swinging back towards more of the traditional French sound. But I think it's I think it's just natural that there are some changes here and there. And I don't think that's so bad in so many ways. Right. I mean, for myself and for any students that I might happen to teach, although I don't teach very much, I'm going to plug away at still this same sound concept that I have in my mind. But even still, I studied, you were talking about me studying with Harold, but in certain ways, I think I don't really sound like him. I think I still had in my mind from my younger years the concept of Robert Marsalis, who didn't use vibrato at all.
Right.
And then Harold used a little bit of it, although if you asked him about it, he would say he didn't.
Really?
He considered that part of the natural vibration of how he used his air.
Huh. Now, that's interesting because I've heard recordings during the period of time when he was in the National Symphony. And, over the, let's say, a 25-year period when he eventually left National and got to Boston, and when he started attending Marlborough and being perhaps more influenced by Moyes in some way with regard to vibrato, he seemed to add more vibrato to his approach to playing.
Uh-huh.
So, I didn't hear it quite as much in the late 60s and early 70s when he first got. I may be incorrect about that, but that's what has stuck with me. And so that's interesting that he didn't consider that anything, unusual for a principal player to use.
Right. I think he didn't want to talk about it much to begin with. But then when you would kind of pull him on it, he would say, well, I don't really do it. It's just kind of the air, the way I use the air, how I want to keep the intensity of the air going.
Right. Now,
but and another thing you said back there was interested me too, because you said that Harold and Marsalis had quite different sound concepts. But I found one great similarity in that they both kept a very concise center to their sound that had lots of vibration and color and life. And I found that core of their sound to be very similar.
Interesting.
And then the outer edges of it to just be a little slightly different.
Now, do you attribute that to the fact that both were Buffet R13 players, or was it the period of time they grew up in? I mean, what do you think? Was it just happenstance that both great players heard sounds that had great overtone presence?
I think it came from their training. I mean, I think in certain ways, I talked about these two different lineages, but in certain ways, those lineages were rather similar. You talked about Hamlin on one side and then Bonnat on the other side. I think there is a certain similarity there. I remember Harold used to talk a lot about, talk about McLean, and he always wanted his sound to be very present and still a good core to the sound, even in the very back of the concert hall. And that McLean would gather some students in his apartment building, and he would go into a closet with his clarinet, and he'd shut the door and he'd say, "Go down the hallway and tell me if you still hear this core of the sound at pianissimo level if I'm playing, from far away." So that was very important to McLean, and Harold reiterated the same thing to me a lot as a student, that how well your sound projects at the pianissimo level is really an important thing.
Right.
And I like to still try to think of it now. I mean, I like probably all of us, I'm still at age almost 60, still trying to get a sound that I think would be good enough or even close enough that either Harold Wright or Bob Marcellus would say, "Oh, that's okay."
I'm sure they would. I'm absolutely sure they would. So when you're practicing at home, and sound is very much a part of your consciousness when you're playing, what things do you practice to sort of act as the litmus test for you with regard to your sound? Are there specific licks or pieces or etudes that you tend to draw on? You mentioned earlier about the operatic etudes from Lazarus.
I don't think I have anything real specific. I think mostly it's just that over the years, the concept of my sound has been intensified and in my mind. I think that's where your sound really comes from. I think it's kind of interesting. If you hand me very different equipment now, within a few minutes, I'll get it back to what I think is my sound, because I think mostly our sound comes from there. Once you've gotten kind of through some of your college years or conservatory years, that you've started to figure out what it is that you want to sound like, or if that's important to you.
Right.
I think, some people find that they really want to concentrate on the technique or some other aspect of the playing. For me, I still keep, when I'm picking out equipment or I'm picking out reeds, I'm always, I think, trying to get to that concept in my mind of what the sound should be like.
Right.
And so if I pull out I'm going through a set of reeds, it might just be I'll be checking on a few different passages from the orchestral repertoire that I'm working on that week. And I'm trying to find the reed that lets me get this sound that I think is right for those excerpts in combination with the sound that's in my head of what the clarinet should or could sound like.
Right. And now, just a slight segue from this. You spent a few seasons, not only you spent 3 years studying with Harold, but you also spent a few seasons sitting next to him in the orchestra before you assumed the position after he passed. How influential was that? How much do you think that influenced you when you ultimately moved over and assumed his chair when you sat next to him for those few seasons?
Well, it was really only one season.
Once.
So when I came in as the second clarinetist in the Boston Symphony next to Harold playing principal, it was kind of monumental for me at the time to get to come back after quite a few years away. I had played for 4 years in Venezuela and then almost 8 years in Charleston, South Carolina, to come back after those 12 years and be next to his live sound again, and then to get to interact with it as a player. That was important for me. It was exciting for me and a challenge for me as well, I think.
Did you find it easy to adapt to playing with him?
Well, I did. I remember even in the audition process, which included some playing with Harold, I think when they narrowed it down to about 3 of us in the final round, they had all 3 of us play with Harold, and maybe even a few other of the woodwind section, I forget. But it felt like coming home to me. I mean, as a student in Boston, at Boston University, I would go every week to the Boston Symphony concerts. You could buy a rush ticket on Saturday nights. And I had a big French horn playing friend, and he and I knew just where to stand so that if I pushed on him when they opened the door, we would get right in. And the top 10, we'd get good tickets that way. Apologize now for anybody we may have shoved out of the way.
It's okay. The president does
Yeah,
it.
I know. I'm really sad about thinking I could be like our present president. But anyway, I think that was half my education in a certain way, was going to those Boston Symphony concerts and hearing Harold play the repertoire, to hear the orchestra playing, to hear, to see Seiji conducting, to hear the great soloists, of course.
And that hall, which is for me the best hall I've ever played in my life, and both on stage and in the audience. I mean, it's a real treat. And if you haven't, for our listeners, if you haven't had the experience of going to Symphony Hall to hear the Boston Symphony, make it a point at some point. Take a vacation in Boston and do that. It's really special. There are, I think, in my experience, there are a few halls, Carnegie, especially the old Carnegie, and Symphony Hall in Boston, among the halls that I've played in our country, stick out to me as being, the end.
Yeah.
And so studying with Harold, hearing him on a weekly basis in that hall, that's what a treat.
Right.
Yeah. But let's talk now a little bit about your equipment, because you fall, like I mentioned, in my eyes, in line with the tradition of the great French players that came through the 20th century. What is the equipment that you are presently playing that you've arrived at?
So I'm playing R13 buffet clarinets. I have all the way through, even back to junior high school days in Indianapolis. But and then I have I actually use a couple of Guy Hadash's barrels that I like quite a bit. And then for the last, I think 6 or 7 years now, I've been playing Brad Bain's mouthpieces.
Right, and Brad is, for the listeners may know, Brad is also one of the people we interviewed in this series, and please go back and hopefully check that out now, because that will give you some insight into how Brad's concept of sound have evolved, and certainly with Bill, one can hear that in the best way. I know you, just from talking with Brad, you've used different models of his mouthpieces over the years.
I have progressed through a few different ones that he's made, and this latest one I've been playing a little over a year now is his most recent production. It's called an Epic, the Brad Bain Epic mouthpiece, which is a direct copy of a virtually unplayed Shedville that he had found. And I think it fits right in there in the concept of what Harold was always playing Shedvilles. Marcellus played Caspers, but I still think it still fits into that concept of sound.
Yes. And is it a large chamber Epic or a small chamber?
I don't even know. Fred just tells me, I go and I try a bunch of them, and Brad writes down what I have in case people ask. So if people ask me what is it, you have to ask Brad. But
that's fun.
Although I do know this latest one that I've been playing this past year is quite close, probably the closest I've ever played.
Huh. When you say close, you mean the tip opening?
The tip opening, I think, is a 96.
Wow.
Which is
that's tight.
Closer than I've ever played before, but I like it. It's
right. And Brad's just come out with a new reed called the Aria. Are you playing those reeds?
Yes,
as well?
I've been playing the Aria reeds, and I'm finding pretty good success on those. He and I are still kind of bandying back and forth about seeing if we could come up with another model of a reed that could do some things slightly different than the Aria does. I don't know if we'll get there or not. I'm very slow about getting back to him sometimes, so he may have to go move ahead sometimes without me. But
right.
It's been both the mouthpiece and the reed things that I've been doing with Brad Bain have been very educational for me. It's actually been a real inspiration for me these last few years of my playing career. I'm really enjoying kind of working on these. Right. It's getting me closer to what I had up here for a long time, I think.
Right. Now, when you're choosing a mouthpiece or a reed, what are the, and I guess it harkens back to a question I had earlier, but are there specific licks that you use to test for a reed or a mouthpiece when you're trying to make choices in that regard?
Well, I end up a lot of times going back just to a lot of the standard audition repertoire. So, I'll play a little of Midsummer Night's Dream Scherzo, or I'll play the first movement of Beethoven 6, the end there, the thing that drives us all crazy. Or I'll play some of the second movements from that same Beethoven 6. Sometimes I want to see if a reed or a mouthpiece, if it can open up enough so that I can get some sound out within the orchestra. So I like playing this little lick from Strauss, Don Juan, I believe.
Oh yes. Yeah.
And on the wrong clarinet, which is how Marcellus used to do it that way. He'd say, switch clarinets, it's so much more fun in this key rather than the other key, So a lot of times I'll do that. And, other things that will just come to mind. Sometimes I'll go back to some of these old Lazarus opera tunes and I'll just play one of those just because I like playing that melody.
Yeah, interesting. After all these years of playing in orchestras throughout the world, and now 25 years in Boston, what are your favorite? What is your favorite repertoire to play?
Well, I always come back to the Brahms symphonies. There's something magical about those symphonies for a clarinet player. They, no matter how much you play them, they don't get old. You come back and it's both familiar and still really challenging. And I like that. Um, I just love playing them. We just recorded all four symphonies with the Boston Symphony with Andres Nelson's conducting.
Oh, terrific.
In this past, I think December. No, it would have been in November. This November of 2016. We recorded all four live in concerts
Symphony Hall?
in Symphony Hall.
Great.
And they pulled different material, I'm sure, from the different nights of the concerts. But they've released them now. All four are out on the private Boston Symphony label.
Terrific.
And I haven't heard them, so it may be that I sound horrible on those recordings.
I would
like
I would
playing
bet
them.
against that.
So
That's nice to hear that one can still, find great meaning in, the most standard of repertoire and not get bored after, so many years of listening to them, playing them. And
it's interesting, you go back, we play Tchaikovsky 6 almost every summer at Tanglewood.
Right.
And that I start to get tired of, or I'm playing this couple of those solos in that Pathétique, and I start thinking, what am I going to do with it now, kind of. But then things that I still like playing, maybe not quite, we don't do it as frequently, like the Rachmaninoff symphonic dances, and then of course there's some of the fun repertoire for clarinets, like I would love to get to do the Galanta dances again soon. I've probably only done it 3 or 4 times in my career. One I don't want to do again, and has been rare in my career, we did the Hinastera variations.
wow. I think in a prior interview, I can't remember who I mentioned that. I think that's the hardest. I mean, when you have to be up there on, the top of the horn in the extreme altissimo. I mean,
well, I cheat on that. I pick up a D clarinet to play the.
Oh, really? For the run up
to
there?
play up to the high D. Yeah. So.
Wow. Okay.
But even still, that's just nerve wracking.
Yeah.
I don't even know if we repeated that one. If you did that one every summer, would I ever get comfortable on it? I don't know.
Yeah.
That's tricky. There's a lot of tricky ones.
Yeah.
That show up every once in a while.
Well, you also have an extended history with the Boston Chamber Players. What conscious changes do you make, if any, when you play in the role from playing principal in the orchestra to playing in a chamber situation? Do you change your equipment in any way? Do you modify things for that change?
I don't really change equipment. I know that, like I remember when Jack Brymer, the clarinetist in London, wrote his book, he would talk about using different mouthpieces for orchestral playing as opposed to chamber music playing. But I tend to just stay on what I'm on. And I think part of it is because our Boston Symphony chamber player concerts are almost always interspersed during a symphonic Boston Symphony week. So I've got I'll play rehearsals on Friday morning and then play Friday afternoon Boston Symphony concert. Right. And then the next day, Saturday in the afternoon, I'll have a Boston Symphony chamber players rehearsal in the afternoon. And then I'll have to go play the concert with the symphony orchestra that night. So going back and forth like that, I find I like to stay on the same equipment. And maybe I choose a slightly different reed depending on what the chamber music piece is I'm playing.
Right.
So I think you just kind of, I tend to like to stay on the same equipment because I'm really familiar with it. And then I just try to hear what the music is asking for as far as sound, and maybe I vary the reed just a little bit, but or I vary my brain just a little bit.
Right.
But other than that, I don't do a
in
lot of
dealing
changing.
with reeds, as you say, are you someone who spends a lot of time working on your reeds, and what process do you use to get the reeds going from the time you open the box?
I use a very technical procedure for reeds. It's called the spray and pray method. So yeah, you just spray out a lot of reeds out on the desk, and then you pray one of them is going to work. I don't work on them very much. Every once in a while, I take a file out and I do a little thing on the shoulders, or really rarely I'll get out some old reed rush and I'll scratch away on a couple places that I think might help, but other than that, I really don't do much.
That's funny.
But it brings me back to a story. I love this story. So Patsy Cardillo was good friends with Benny Goodman, and when Benny would come to play concertos with the Boston Pops or the Boston Symphony, he would call up Patsy and say, "I need to come over tonight," and Patsy'd say, "Okay," and Benny would come in with a box, and he'd come to Patsy's coffee table, and he would pour the box of reeds, huge box of reeds, out on the coffee table, and he'd say, "Patsy, help me find a reed. I got to play the concerto."
Oh, well, yet another one of the Benny Goodman stories. But that's I studied with a teacher for a while from the Philharmonic, Peter Semenauer, who was a wonderful man and player. And I remember taking a lesson at his home in Montclair, New Jersey, and it was a beautiful studio, but the entire studio was enveloped with boxes of Van Doren reeds. I mean, hundreds upon hundreds. And I said, "Peter, wow, this is amazing. You have a lifetime stock." He said, "No, that's one season." and I didn't quite get it. He said, I go through the box. If the reed plays, I play it, and I throw the others out. And he says, "I'm very happy that way." Of course, those days the reeds didn't cost what they're costing today, so that's the other part of the coin. Now when it's 25,
but do you think it's
$30.
changed? I mean, sure, they're more expensive now, but relative to what we were making,
No,
do you think it's changed
no,
at all? Really?
I'm a sports fanatic, and so in following baseball, the best players, the most successful players, the All-Stars generally have batting averages 300 or more. And I've always said, for myself and to students, you're never going to have a major league box. You're going to get 2 out of 10 if you're lucky, and maybe 1 out of 10 if you want to count on it. Don't expect to get an all-star box of 300 or more,
That's
3
right.
out of 10. I have to tell you this story. I'm sure you may have heard this, and I hope I say it right. Our mutual friend Stu Hirsch told me this, that years ago Stanley Drucker was in Paris and went to the Van Doren factory, and they said, "Mr. Drucker, what would you like to see? What can we show you?" And he said, "I'd like to meet the man who puts the one good reed in the box of Now, I don't know if it's true or not, but it's a great story, and yeah, that's that seems to be what we're up against.
Well, what's funny is, so you were saying that Peter Semenauer said he threw out the rest of them.
Yeah.
Well, I don't throw them out.
Yeah.
I throw them in a big box in the closet.
Uh-huh.
And then, 5 years later, I'll go through them again. And if I think they change a little bit, and I think also that if you've changed equipment, then
Right.
sometimes you end up picking a
Yes.
slightly different reed. So
Yes.
over the years, I've had some success by going back through 2 or 3 times
Interesting.
over what was formerly discarded. But it gets slimmer and slimmer the more times you go back. I will tell you that.
Yeah, yeah. It's not a bottomless pit. Okay, so when you're on your own, like now you're in a break from the orchestra before you begin your Tanglewood season. When you're playing for your own pleasure, what things do you tend to practice as far as maybe etudes or repertoire pieces? Are there specific things you sort of like to go back to practice?
So what's interesting, I'll go back to those Lazarus studies that I still love. I love playing the transcriptions of the Bach things, the Bach cello suites, and some of the violin suites. I'll end up, a lot of times I'll end up picking just one movement or two movements, a fast one and a slow one. And then I'll just work on them for a couple weeks. I love trying to figure out the phrasing of the Bach, finding the music in there. I find it to be kind of a good relief from trying to always have the orchestral repertoire ready. I find it kind of calming. And so I just love going back and playing them. Sometimes I'll go back to some of my favorite ones out of those. You know, I play a lot out of the Jaime Waxman transcription book, you know, of those, a lot of different Bach things. So, and then there's a few things in the Perrier book that I used to use with Harold. And what was interesting, it was Harold that put me on to doing some of those Bach transcriptions. Huh. I don't ever do them in public. I just do them for myself in my own room. Right. You know, I know it would make some string players just sick to think of me doing it, but
well, if you play any string music on a non-string instrument, it doesn't matter clarinet.
Yeah.
Oh, you know, you'll get the wrath. Who are the players you listen to? I mean, you've mentioned obviously some of Marcellus and Harold Wright, but in your own spare time, who are the clarinet players you tend to like to listen to, or who are some of the players maybe today who are very impressed by, younger players perhaps coming up?
Oh, I don't have specifics. I actually don't listen very much anymore. I like to get away. That's partly why I don't teach so much, is that I like spending a lot of energy on playing in the orchestra, preparing my parts for the orchestra, playing the chamber music. And then I just need a few hours sometimes each day to put it away and let my brain kind of regroup. I've heard lots of wonderful clarinet playing on different recordings in the past few years, but I don't have specific players that I go back to and listen a lot. And I don't even really like to go back now and listen too much to some of the old recordings that I listened to of my teachers before. I tend to like to now try to figure out my own voice in a certain way.
Right.
And so I wouldn't even know what to recommend for people to listen to.
That's interesting when you talk about finding your own voice and refining it, which is something we generally hear from jazz players. Who maybe let's say a saxophone player who grew up listening to Charlie Parker, or a tenor player to John Coltrane, and after a while, trying to find their own voice, you have to sort of move away from that. There is a famous story in the jazz world. The great jazz pianist, composer Horace Silver wrote at one time that at a certain point in time he had to stop listening to Thelonious Monk and Bud Powell, and for a year he put all his records and his Victrola at the time up in a closet and just played, only listening to himself. And he said that's how he began to evolve his style, his concepts of playing. So it's interesting. I don't hear that being talked about too much in the orchestral world, classical music performers, as much as jazz players. So that's very interesting that you mentioned that. And with regard to teaching, you meant you're not affiliated necessarily with any university or conservatory, but I know you do clinics or master classes from time to time, and you do performances, especially with your wife Catherine, who's also a fine clarinetist. Do you have any plans to perhaps broaden that in the future, to do more teaching, or would that be something at a point in time, maybe when you might retire?
It's funny you bring it up, because starting this fall, I'm going to take on one student at New England Conservatory. I'm taking on one freshman, and I think it's a young lady, and so that'll be the first time I've taught steadily in a long time. I subbed for Dick Stoltzman for a set of 7 weeks or so for 3 of his students last semester, just to kind of get my fingers wet a little bit on teaching again over at a school setting. So it'll be kind of fun to see what I like teaching, and I enjoy. I mean, who doesn't enjoy kind of spouting off what they think they know? And so I'm looking forward to that side of it. But and maybe in the future I'll teach more. I'm starting to lean towards that. And then I also am kind of excited because my wife and I have a very good friend who's a composer down at Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida, near Orlando. The composer's name is Dan Crozier, and he is writing a double concerto for my wife and I that we will premiere in February coming up, that down at Rollins College with the Bach Festival Orchestra. This concerto that he's writing for the two of us. So we're kind of excited about that.
Yeah, and I know that I checked out a YouTube video of both of you doing, I think, the Cromer Concerto. There was something up on YouTube.
Right, we did that at a clinic at, I believe it's Northern Illinois State University or Northern Illinois University, where Greg Barrett, a friend of ours, is the clarinet professor at that school.
Well, that's great. And I know your wife also runs as we were talking about earlier, when you first got here, she runs a chamber music festival up in your summer home up in West Stockbridge. So is it possible we're going to be seeing more and more of you in a soloistic light or in chamber works outside of the Boston Chamber Players?
Sometimes. I just played down in Fredericksburg, Virginia, at a little music festival there for a week with some of my colleagues from the Boston Symphony and a few people here from New York even. But, I love playing any of the good chamber music. So people call me. I'm usually, if I can get there, I'll play it.
Great. Now, how about a solo CD? I mean, that's something we the clarinet world would love to hear.
You keep mentioning this. I don't know. I have not really felt pushed to do it. I don't know why exactly. It's a lot of work to make a recording that I think you'd want to put out there. And my schedule with the Boston Symphony is rather intense and is tiring enough in some ways.
Sure.
So whether I'll get to that or not, I'm not really sure.
Okay. But just keep it in the back of your mind. A lot of us would love to hear that. And, however that can be done, that would be a real...
What's kind of interesting about it is that I like a lot of the standard repertoire. And I feel like all of that has been recorded quite a few times, and many times quite beautifully. And I'm not sure I would have more to say than what's already out there. I don't know. But
I understand what you're saying. But, there are... look, how many times has the Mozart Quintet been recorded, the Brahms Quintet, the trio, of course. But everybody has a slightly different take on it, and and sometimes we're talking about just the nuances of the phrasing, the nuances of the tone, tempi, and things like that. And I think that's important. Also, I think if you do more teaching, as you've indicated, students love to hear their teachers on recordings,
right?
And that sometimes goes hand in hand, and that even if you feel like it's been done so well, students still want to hear their teachers do it. So maybe if you think of it in those terms,
All right.
to go hand in hand with your teaching as the
I'll
years
take
go
it
on.
under advisement.
Okay.
Ed.
But anyway, you alluded to the Boston Symphony schedule, and as we spoke just before the interview began, I indicated that from my perspective, over the years, I've always thought the Boston Symphony had the most rigorous schedule of any of the American major orchestras. Can you talk a little bit about that for our viewers so they really get a chance to see what a symphony player has to deal with day in and day out, schedule-wise, what it's like to have to look at a year in front of you, such as you have with the orchestra?
Well, I imagine all the big orchestras are really rather similar as far as the winter schedule, for sure, as how busy they are. And that, I think, is pretty standard. It's almost always just at least one big work each week. Sometimes there can be another overture or, like a Galanta dances or something like that that's thrown in that makes the week even bigger for you. Or in the case in the Boston Symphony now, we've been doing a lot of, we're slowly working our way through all the Shostakovich symphonies that are being recorded for DG. And the way those are recorded now are always from live performances, partly because it's much less expensive for the recording company.
Of course. Well, especially when you have a place like Symphony Hall to record.
Right.
It's like a double win. And the beauty is the orchestra is comfortable in the hall. And so.
Right.
By the way, do you record on the stage? Or I had heard from someone years ago that oftentimes they would take out all the chairs in Symphony Hall and the orchestra would record on the floor of Symphony Hall.
Well, those years would have been well before I joined the orchestra. When I joined the orchestra, it was just near the end of the kind of recording era that was being funded by all the big pop records and everything that kind of funded all classical recording.
Right.
And then when all the media shifts happened with the way that people could get music, it kind of defunded recording. So back in those days that you're talking about, I have heard stories that sometimes they would move the orchestra into the middle of the hall, take out the seats and move them out there to try to. Right. I think they tried it many different ways, but the last few years, that they were recording a lot for the big recording companies, Philips and DG and maybe somebody else. Those would have been my first years in the Boston Symphony. We were on the stage, and they would set up 1 million different microphones all around. And even the first couple of years I was in the orchestra, we still had the seats that we sat on were these cane bottom seats. That they were nice because they breathed, right. But they made noise.
Oh.
And so I remember Seiji saying, "Now don't anybody move, you're going to make the seat creak, And we'd be playing some soft passage and somebody's seat would start creaking. It was funny, those trying to stop all those noises."
Right. Yeah, sorry, I got off track for a second, but you were talking about, the schedule from during the year and the winter season being very busy and so forth. But your Tanglewood season in the summertime is longer than most orchestras have for whatever summer festivities they enjoy. I mean, you is it 8 or 9 weeks now that you're up there?
Right. It's always the month of July and August, 8 weeks generally. And in those 8 weeks, we fit in the equivalent of a whole winter season.
Wow.
Of repertoire. So some weekends it can be you'll play 3 different programs, a Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. I mean, you might play Beethoven 6 on Friday. You might play Rocky 2 on Saturday. You might play Bartok Concerto for Orchestra on Sunday. And then some weeks maybe you'll get lucky and you only have to do 2 big concerts the weekend. Right. But then you throw in a few chamber music concerts here or there.
Right.
And So that when I first joined the orchestra, both as second clarinetist and then as becoming the principal, those first few years at Tanglewood are really daunting when you look at the rep that you're having to go through. So it takes you kind of a while before you can settle down and start to be a little bit comfortable.
And by the way, for the listeners, BSO will be up starting the week of July 4th in Tanglewood. And on Thursday, July 6th, Bill will be performing at night in Ozawa Hall, the Shepherd on the Rock. And that's a real treat if you can get up there. And just in general, not that it needs any promo, but Tanglewood is one of the great places on earth to spend time during the summer and hear music and just be in that environment. So if you haven't had the opportunity yet, please take it upon yourself to try to get up to Tanglewood at some point during the summer. And certainly if you're free Thursday, July 6th, you'll hear Bill playing one of the great pieces, Schubert's Shepherd on the Rock. So Bill, with all the work you've done in orchestral work and chamber music work, do you have time to listen to other types of music? Are there other types of music that you enjoy listening to or even playing outside of the classical realm?
I don't really play outside of the classical realm at all. I enjoy hearing it sometimes, but one of the things I have been doing recently is listening to some great artists from the past, not a clarinetist. So, like just today and the last month, I've found these 5-set CDs of Rudolf Serkin playing Schubert music. And I just, when I'm in the car, I stick them in the CD player, and I have been kind of going back through them quite, I like to start to know the piece and then start to figure out what Serkin did with it. Sometimes I'll go online and try to find a copy of the score, on M-Slip or something, and just see some of the music and then listen to it again. I find that quite interesting. And calming too. So
Interesting. Did any of the great jazz clarinet players, Benny Goodman, Artie Shaw, Buddy DeFranco, or Eddie Daniels, have any of them been influential to you in any way, or is it something you ever try to dabble with or just fool around with?
I'm so bad at jazz, that would be horrible. I never really listened a lot. It was not something in my household. Although my mother used to play boogie woogie on the piano, I used to like that. But I like hearing the jazz clarinetists, but I guess I don't go out of my way to hear it per se.
Okay.
I don't know. I'm a stick in the mud. What can I say?
No, it's interesting. Everybody has a different take on it and what influences the head growing up. It is interesting.
I always wished I could do it, but you can't pick it up and just do it. I mean, I almost feel like you had to kind of choose your path somewhere back there.
Yeah.
And then the players that can do kind of both, that mystifies me. That's really amazing.
Yeah, it is. They are two divergent paths, but it like you were saying, listening to Serkin to get inspiration and so forth. I'm just wondering if sometimes going across genres can also be inspiring within the genre that you play. That's why I was interested. I know for me, I mean, those particular jazz players have been, idols of mine in many ways, and it's just another thing like, wow, if I could get to close to that level or just being able to see how that level works, it would be something. But it's interesting. Everybody is very different about that. I know your colleague in the orchestra, Tom Martin, had a great deal of experience playing jazz at one time in his life, and and so it's different for everybody.
Right.
It's amazing. the Boston Symphony Clarinet section, I think, for me, and I'm not saying this because you're here, I've said this to many people, for me, it's my favorite clarinet section. And you have four tremendous musicians and clarinet players, not just good orchestral players. I mean, it's really something with you and Tom Martin, Mike Wayne, Craig Nordstrom. You've been together now as a section for a little while. I guess the second clarinet was the most recent addition.
I think Michael has been there now 9 years.
Right.
So
yeah,
that's a good solid set of years.
Of course, and all are wonderful players, and yet all different. I mean,
right.
It's not like one style of clarinet playing, and everybody has the exact same thing. And yet, as a section, the playing is wonderful and blends beautifully, and really reflects that tradition that we've talked about throughout this interview. It still reflects that type of ability to project the sound, let the sound ring, not being afraid to, get it out there without forcing. Is that something that you talk about in this section, or was it just something that just happened to naturally fit together? Was there a conscious discussion about this?
I think even just the process of auditioning in Symphony Hall kind of narrows it down to that style of playing just a little bit. I think if you come into Symphony Hall and try to play too forcefully, it just doesn't quite work. And that even ties back a little bit, when you were talking about the different halls in this earlier in this interview. I was going to say that really somewhat your concept of sound as an orchestral player starts to take on a little bit what the hall is that you're playing in. So like when the Boston Symphony played in Orchestra Hall in Chicago quite a few years back, as I was sitting there playing in that space, I realized, no, I would want slightly different equipment if I were playing in that hall all the time. And I'm sure that affects what equipment, all across the country, why people need slightly different equipment for where they are to be able to get to the concept of their sound within that space.
Very interesting.
But now I've taken us off on a side track where I'm talking about my colleagues in the Boston Symphony.
And the sound that you get. But I think that's very interesting how the hall itself can mold, in a sense, the sound of a group and of a section.
Uh-huh. And then, of course, they're all wonderful players. I think it was an honor to have been accepted into the section by Craig Nordstrom and Tom Martin when I first, and of course Harold was there at that time too, but to join that section, and I think certainly all those players were in that vein that you're talking about when I came in, and I think then later on when Michael Wayne came and joined us, certainly we were all sitting there looking for somebody that we thought could work sound-wise with us as well as all the other aspects of playing orchestrally. And of course, he's a great addition to the orchestra, and we've enjoyed playing with him over these years.
Right. Now, you alluded to earlier the new Brahms recordings that the orchestra is just releasing, and the Shostakovich symphonies that you're in the process of completing and for release. Are there any other projects or that you see the Boston Symphony moving in a direction, or what direction do you see the orchestra moving in now that you have a new music director and things have settled down?
I would imagine it's going to be like it has been the last few years. These Shostakovich symphonies have been a big deal. We've been doing 2 or 3 a year. So this year we did number 9 number 7, maybe number 5.
Wow.
I think 9 and 5 is already out.
Wow. That's great news. And 5 has some of the most beautiful solos,
Right.
not only for all the woodwinds. I mean, it's really spectacular.
Maybe we did number 8 already. I can't remember.
Yeah.
And then I bet so. We'll keep going forward with that. That's been a nice addition back. I mean, it's extra work when you always get a little more uptight for those recording nights. But
Right.
I think it's been nice for the orchestra to have Deutsche Grammophon DG there, recording those, being part of that process again. And then I bet we'll keep doing the way that we did the Brahms symphonies this past year. I bet going forward in the future, Andres Nelsons will pick out another set of symphonies or particular set of music that he's interested in. We'll try to record that again on the Boston Symphony private label. As far as chamber music coming up, I haven't heard about any recording in the works coming forward yet.
For the chamber players.
Right, for the chamber players. We didn't do one this year. And it could be if something comes up in the future next year, it may be that it won't include clarinet. I'm not sure. But
Okay. And before we conclude the interview, we're going to have Bill play a little bit and demonstrate some of the music, the licks that he uses, in testing his equipment, his reeds, or things just that he enjoys playing to, get set for rehearsal, practice, performance. And Bill, I want to thank you again for spending the time and coming down today. It's been an honor, and I hope a lot of people will now know more about you and come out and hear you play and come out and hear the orchestra perform, because I think it's really one of the greatest orchestras in the world, and certainly we're lucky here in New York when you guys come to Carnegie on a regular basis during each year. But for those who are out of town and might be coming to New York or Boston, please, try to coordinate that with the performance of the Boston Symphony. I think you'll really enjoy it. And again, we look forward to continuing the Woodwind legacy next year. This is the conclusion of our 3rd season, and we hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll continue to, check it out in the future. Thank you. All right, so Bill, when you take out your clarinet, you're going to begin your practice session. What are some of the things that you do? What are some of the things you noodle on and tend to resort to see if the reed and the horn are in good condition?
well, I think we all have our little signature noodles. For sure, I probably do that always, and then depending on what I'm working on any particular week, what repertoire, I'll often morph into that quite quickly. But you had asked earlier about similar things that I might do when I warm up or when I'm trying new reeds or new mouthpieces. And I talked about the Strauss thing. I love playing this Strauss from Don Juan. I just love seeing how much zing you can get out of that in the sound. I might do a little articulation, such as at the beginning of the Mendelssohn Scherzo. Which is not really working today. But right there, that's telling me something, mostly that I haven't played much this week. Or I might play a little Beethoven 6, something like that, you know.
Right. Now, do you single tongue when you do the Mendelssohn, or do you use a double tongue?
I single tongue everything. I've never learned double tonguing. The few times I've heard people double tonguing on the clarinet, I've not really enjoyed that sound very much, so
Okay.
I've kind of shied away from it.
Oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you, there is an unwritten law here that any reed that you play in the house has to stay in the house even when you leave.
Oh no, this one still could get me through maybe even a concert, so I got to hold on to that one.
Okay. Oh, gosh.
Here's this old Lazarus book I was talking about, the Etude book. One of the melodies from there I've always loved. And then it goes into a polaka, but
Beautiful. Wow. I'll be looking through my old Lazarus books for those. That's wonderful, though, because these are the type of things that I hope that these videos will inspire others to look at and look, towards using as rehearsal tool. What your buffet is? What vintage? How old?
I buy them every 8 years or so. So this is fairly new. I think this is 627, 761. So,
Yeah.
between playing them a lot in the orchestra, especially the B flat, and then also playing in Tanglewood, which is an outdoor venue, the amount of shrinking and expanding that the clarinet does, it pretty rapidly starts to change the bore around the throat tones and everything. So you start to feel it not centering down as much, the sound.
Right. So you find there's a point at which the horn seems to lose a little bit, maybe get to a little bit of a point of blowout that you need to
right.
change.
If I'm still not getting the amount of center and core to the sound that I want, I'll start to notice it, and I'll start to think, well, could that be the clarinet again?
Right.
So.
Right. But once again, you're using a Buffet R13 with a Bradbane Epic mouthpiece.
That's right, and a
an
ligature
Ari-
that Stu Hirsch gave me.
Ishimori, I see.
Because he had seen me in an Ishimori advertisement, and I wasn't using an Ishimori. He said, as a gift for a favor I did for him, he gave me this ligature and said, you really should be using it. And so I took it home and I put it on. I went, well, maybe it is better. So I've started using it all the time now. I like it.
Well, it's funny. Stu gave me my ligature. It's an old Casper ligature that I'm using. So, Stu, keep those ligatures
That's
coming.
right.
Anyway, Bill, thanks so much for spending our time today and playing. And for those who are listening, I hope you can hear how magnificently pure and effortless the sound is when Bill plays. It's really inspiring to hear that, especially close up. I've heard you from afar for many years, but it's
now you get to hear all the junk in the sound, right?
No, what's amazing is that it sounds so as beautiful close up as it does far away, and that's really something. So I have the best seat in the house here.
Okay.
Right.
Well, it's been fun to talk about it all. I've enjoyed it, Ed.
Great.
Thank you for
Thank
inviting
you,
me.
Bill. I appreciate it.